Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Schwartz Report. In earlier podcasts, you've heard me speak about what I call the Great Schism trend, the fact that we are splitting into two countries, red and blue. The red governed by Republicans, chosen by the people of those states, and the blue governed mostly by Democrats, chosen by the people of those states. Two different cultures, really, more than anything else, who choose very different social approaches. So, according to the Congressional Budget Office, we are a nation of 342 million people. And when I look at the United States, what stands out for me is this great schism trend between the red and the blue. And that's not a political statement. It may sound like it, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about objectively verifiable information, as you can check in my earlier podcasts. Schwartz Report is about facts, not just political philosophies or not political philosophies at all. I am about well-being. That's what I care about. That's why I do this podcast. So the red-blue Great Schism trend is something I have been talking a lot about because I think it's so important. But this week, I want to talk about something else because we are also becoming two countries split with an almost medieval aristocracy of money and a working peasantry, a social differential that has been occurring over the last 50 years that has produced a country that looks very little like it did in earlier decades. No one talks about this, but it is becoming the reality. And in this podcast, I want to talk about this economic schism. So let's start with the norm. According to the Forbes Advisor, the average annual salary in the United States in 2024 is $59,428. That works out to be $28.34 an hour. And if you break it down into the average salary by age group, looks a little bit different. 16 to 19 years, not surprisingly, is the smallest at $32,344 a year. 20 to 24, $39,416. 25 to 34, $56,160. 35 to 44, $67,756. With an average of, as I say, 59,428. But that's just the majority. I want to talk about this emerging aristocracy of money. According to the 2024 Ramsey Solution Study, the United States now has almost 24.5 million millionaires. That's more than the entire population of Florida. It's about 7.17% of the whole American population. And the number of millionaires in the US has been growing throughout the economic recovery, with the strongest growth at the very top of the wealth ladder. And that's the group that I really want to focus on because that's where it really becomes the clearest of this schism that I'm talking about. According to the Forbes 2024 World Billionaires list, the United States has 813 billionaires. That's 9 zeros. According to CEO World, as of May 2024, The 10 wealthiest billionaires in the United States have a combined value of more than $1 trillion. Actually, it's close to $1.5 trillion, 1,465,500,000,000 specifically. And I just want to focus on the top 10 because that makes the point. Jeff Bezos, 203.8 billion. Elon Musk, 198.4 billion. Mark Zuckerberg, 158.7 billion. Larry Ellison, 144.9 billion. Larry Page, 138.9 billion. Sergey Brin, 133.2 billion. Warren Buffett, 131.7 billion. Bill Gates, 128.5 billion. Steve Ballmer, 121.2 billion. Michael Bloomberg, 106.2 billion. That's just 10 people. 10 people. Combined wealth of $1.5 trillion. That's more than some countries. But it's when you get into the details of that it really becomes clear what I'm trying to say about this grotesque schism that has arisen in the United States. Let's start with Jeff Bezos. His share of 2023 profits by company, $985 a second, $59,100 a minute, $3,546,000 per hour, $85,104,000 per day, $595,728,000 per week. Now remember, the average income in the United States, $59,428, $28.34 per hour. So Jeff Bezos is making more in a minute than most people make in a year. Look at Mark Zuckerberg. As of January 2024, he was the third richest person in the world with a net worth of 158.7 billion. And according to the Forbes real-time billionaires list, he had an increase of 84 billion in 1 year, which translates to 9.6 million per hour, or approximately 230.6 million each day. Now again, $9.6 million an hour as opposed to the average $28 an hour. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about this grotesque distortion that has occurred in the United States. The overall median wealth for households in the U.S. is $192,900. And it's very strongly skewed racially, but not just racially. 1 in 5 U.S. households has zero or negative net worth. Underwater households, they're called. They make up an even higher share of households when you just consider households of color. More than 30% of Black households, 27% of Latino households have zero or negative net worth to fall back on. Do you begin to see what I'm talking about? There's something deeply wrong. We have become a country not only that's a nation that has split into 2 countries, red and blue, but we have also created a kind of medieval wealth inequity. something that never been seen before. Let me contrast that with what the founders had in mind. To get a clear picture, let's look at what the United States had become a few decades after the founders had created it, after what they had tried to do had come to pass. And to do this, there's no better source than Alexis Charles Henri Clérel de Tocqueville. He was the scion of one of the oldest Norman noble families in France. And he came here in 1831, a few decades after the United States began, accompanied by his close friend Gustave de Beaumont. Officially, he had been sent to study America's prison system because it was thought that the American prison system was an advance over what they had in Europe. But in fact, he also sought to learn what was happening in a country that had weathered revolution and had begun this democratic social experiment whose echoes were still sweeping across Europe. And he and de Beaumont traveled around the United States for 9 months, talking to people, looking at things, reading the local press, having discussions with both Americans, both rich and poor. And out of those experiences, de Tocqueville crafted Democracy in America, a book that is recognized as one of the enduring masterpieces of cultural and political observation about democracy and inequity. And although he was the representative, de Tocqueville, of a culture that almost worshiped continuity and class differences, he saw something that really impacted him. He saw and appreciated that the crux of democracy was the capacity for change. He wrote that Americans, and here's a quote, have all a lively faith in the perfectibility of man. They consider society as a body in a state of improvement, humanity as a changing scene in which nothing is or ought to be permanent. And they admit that what appears to them today to be good may be superseded by something much better tomorrow. You see that difference right there? He understood that America was defined in its quest for change by its desire, and this is really the key to the thing, an equality of condition amongst its citizens. He described liberty as the ultimate political value and wrote that democracy was the irresistible future that would foster well-being. His principal passion was about equality, an issue perhaps even more resonant today than it was in the mid-19th century when he was visiting, because what history has made apparent is that liberty, equality, and the ability to change do in fact lie at the core of social fairness, what I call fostering well-being, the theorem of well-being as I frame it. That's the difference between de Tocqueville's day of equality and what we see today. And you can get this very clearly when you go and see the houses of the founders. In the early years of the American story, even wealthy people, their wealth was mostly tied into land, or, and this has been a lifelong crisis for the country, in owning people. But even then, as anyone who visits George Washington's Mount Vernon will discover, when you go into the house, the spareness of the room furnishings is quickly noted. The challenge of equality today is not that there's not enough to go around, but that as a society, America has lost this sense of fairness concerning its distribution and how we collectively feel We should treat others individually. And as a result, a growing number of historians and political scientists are doing just what I have been trying to do in my podcast, crying out that we are in very real danger of losing our democracy. And that's not just a political statement. The data is explicit. The trend is growing year by year. We have become, in substance, antipodal to what the United States was founded to be. People like Benjamin Franklin, who saw it as a middle-class country of professionals and workers and a few wealthy people, but nothing like what we have today. Am I exaggerating? Try this on. The United States has the highest rate of income inequality among Western countries. And let me give you the source about this inequality. In 2018, Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, was sent to the United States to assess the nation's inequality on the basis of data, not politics, because it was becoming apparent that something was going on in this country that other countries could see, but we didn't see or weren't doing anything about. And Alston found that there was not another Western country with inequality as pronounced as the United States. He reported the 1.5 trillion in tax cuts engineered in December 7, 2017 by the Republicans overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy and worsened inequality. The consequences of neglecting poverty and promoting inequality have become clear in these last decades. The United States has one of the highest poverty and inequality levels amongst the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, basically the developed nations of the world. And the Stanford Center on Inequality and Poverty ranks it, the United States, 18th out of 21 wealthy countries in terms of labor markets, poverty rates, safety nets, wealth inequality, and economic mobility. For almost 5 decades, the overall policy response has been neglectful. But the policies pursued over the past few years seem deliberately designed to remove basic protections from the poorest. We have people in Congress who want to eliminate Social Security, eliminate health care. They want to punish those who are not in employment. We want to make basic health care into a privilege that has to be earned rather than a right of citizenship. We have the largest incarcerated population in the world, over 2 billion people. We are becoming not just two countries, but two countries which are also within themselves broken into an aristocracy of wealth and a peasantry with a small middle class. We face an election in November, and our democracy is on the line. But so is this split. And so I want to ask you, when you have a chance to talk to anyone who has anything to do with politics, ask them to give you objectively measurable information about how they propose to make America a fairer country, a country which fosters well-being, not just greed and profit. Because if we don't make different choices, if we don't develop different policies, we are not going to be a country that our children, let alone their children, will even recognize. It certainly would not be recognized by the founders. Please, let's each get together. Let's organize. Let's make fostering well-being correct. The first priority. Let's change the tax structure and vote for people willing to change the tax structure so that this grotesque distortion of wealth ceases and well-being increases. It's up to you. It's up to me. The question is, are we going to do it? Are we going to come together and demand that this become a country like the founders intended? I hope so. And I hope you'll join me in trying to make that happen. Thank you.